Intro and beginnings, 1890s. When people think of college football history, they think of Ohio State or Alabama. But out in the mountains of the West, Utah was quietly building its own traditions and some of the oldest programs outside the Midwest. From snowy fields in Salt Lake City to rivalries that still rage today, Utah's football story has been overlooked, and I plan to shed some light on it. Now let's rewind the clock to the 1890s and shine the spotlight on Benjamin Cluff. At the time, he was principal of Brigham Young Academy. BYU wouldn't officially take the name until 1903, and he had a vision. While studying at the University of Michigan, one of college football's early powerhouses, Cluff became fascinated with the sport and wanted to bring it west. That dream became a reality in 1896 when BYA fielded its first football team. Their opponents weren't just other colleges, though. They played a hodgepodge of teams like the YMCA of Salt Lake City, the Wheel Club of Denver, Westminster College, Utah Agricultural College, and, of course, the University of Utah. Those early games were far from the polished spectacles we know today. BYA's very first meeting with Utah ended in a 12-4 loss in the spring of 1869. But later that fall, the two schools met twice more, splitting the series 1-1. BYA even claimed some kind of championship that year, though what that title actually meant is anyone's guess. Neither Wikipedia nor the BYU library really clarifies who they beat or what the trophy was, which is both frustrating and hilarious. The record keeping of those days leaves us with more mystery than answers, but what is clear is that football had taken root in Provo. Meanwhile, Utah was also stumbling through those chaotic early years. In 1896, the Utes played 5 games, 3 of which versus BYA. The other 2 were odd by today's matchup standards. A loss against the Salt Lake City Crescents, essentially a local club team, and a win against Salt Lake High School. Yes, you heard that right. At the dawn of college football, one of the state's premier universities was playing high schoolers and local city clubs. Not exactly the Rose Bowl, but it shows just how experimental and unpredictable the sport was in its infancy. Building foundations, 1900s to 1920. The messy beginnings of Utah football in the 1890s soon gave way to a more structured approach in the early 20th century. Brigham Young University, freshly renamed in 1903, was still trying to stabilize its program, but the real surge was coming from the University of Utah and Utah Agricultural College, later Utah State. The Aggies, in particular, were becoming quite formidable. In 1903, they went 3-0 under coach George P. Campbell, proving they weren't destined to be an afterthought. The next big development came in 1909 with the creation of the Rocky Mountain Faculty Athletic Conference, or RMAFC. The conference was founded because schools across Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming wanted to bring order to what had been a chaotic system of local clubs and nearby schools. By setting eligibility rules, consistent schedules, and championship standards, they gave the sport structure. Utah joined in 1910, Utah State followed in 1914, and BYU in 1918. This wasn't just about finding opponents anymore, it was about building credibility. Conferences made sure teams weren't stacking rosters with non-students or breaking rules, a problem that plagued football in its earliest years. By the late 1920s, the sport's growth was visible, not just on the field, but in the facilities. In 1927, the University of Utah opened Ute Stadium, later renamed Rice Stadium, with seating for around 20,000 people. For its time, this was a huge leap forward. Utah was putting real money and ambition into football. That same year in Logan, Utah State opened Romney Stadium, named after legendary coach Dick Romney. With those investments, football in Utah became not just a game, but a centerpiece of campus life. Rivalries take shape, 1930s. The 1930s were when rivals truly crystallized. Utah, under coach Ike Armstrong, dominated much of the local scene. Armstrong had taken over in 1925, and by the time the Utes moved into Ute Stadium in 1927, his disciplined, tough squads had established Utah as the state's flagship football program. Utah State, however, was no pushover. The Aggies claimed conference titles in 1921, 1935, and 1936, showcasing that they could go toe-to-toe with Utah. The BYU rivalry, meanwhile, was beginning to simmer. The Cougars didn't yet have the talent or consistency to match Utah. Geography and religion gave the matchup a unique flavor. Fans on both sides cared deeply about bragging rights, even if the games weren't always competitive. By the end of the decade, the framework was clear. Utah was the top dog, Utah State could contend in flashes, and BYU was still in the early stages of building its identity. Postwar football, 1940s to 1960s. World War II changed everything. Rosters across the nation thinned as young men went to serve, and the Utah schools were no exception. Some programs temporarily suspended play, and others scrambled to field teams. When the war ended, though, football came back stronger than ever. The GI Bill meant veterans flooded into universities and brought athletic talent with them. Crowds grew, and the Utah football scene matured rapidly in this era. Utah thrived under Ike Armstrong, who coached until 1949. By the end of his career, he had accumulated 141 wins, setting a standard for consistency that defined Utah football for decades. His teams weren't necessarily national powers, but they established Utah as a respected regional brand. Utah State also had its golden stretch in the late 1950s and early 1960s under John Ralston. The Aggies appeared in bowl games, upset big-name opponents, and sent players to the NFL. Merlin Olsen, their most famous product, became one of the greatest defensive linemen in football history, and later a Pro Football Hall of Famer. BYU, by contrast, still struggled. They joined the Rocky Mountain Conference in 1918, but from then until the early 1960s, they were rarely competitive. The Holy War was more about pride than parity, as Utah routinely dominated the series. The Skyline Conference Transition. Before the WAC came into being, Utah schools briefly competed in the Skyline Conference, also known as the Mountain States Conference, which ran from 1938 to 1962. The league was formed when the Rocky Mountain Conference had grown too large and unwieldy, splitting the bigger schools off from the smaller colleges. The goal was to create more competitive balance and reduce travel, which has been a financial strain for many programs. For Utah, Utah State, and BYU, this era was a stepping stone. It introduced more formal rivalries and clearer standings, but lacked the national profile of later leagues. By the late 1950s, however, it was clear the Skyline Conference wasn't sustainable. Membership had dwindled, and many schools wanted a conference that would align them with institutions of similar size and ambition. That led directly to the founding of the WAC in 1962. The WAC Era Begins, 1960s. By 1962, Utah, BYU, and Utah State all joined the newly formed Western Athletic Conference. The WAC was born out of necessity. Schools in the Mountain West region wanted more visibility and stronger competition than the Skyline had provided. Travel had become easier with post-war infrastructure, and athletic departments were eager to expand their profiles. Founding members like Utah, BYU, Arizona, and Arizona State saw the WAC as a chance to step into the international spotlight while keeping a Western identity. For Utah schools, this was transformative. Utah now had a conference with bigger reach. BYU had a chance to build itself against constant benchmarks, and Utah State gained legitimacy from being grouped with larger universities. The WAC also intensified rivalries. Now the Holy War was not just about state bragging rights, but had conference title implications. Fans became more invested, and the media treated the rivalry as one of the WAC's premier matchups. LaVell Edwards and a New Era, 1970s. The biggest turning point of the era came in 1972 when BYU hired LaVell Edwards as head coach. Edwards brought vision and innovation. He believed the passing game could level the playing field against bigger, faster defenses, and he committed to throwing the ball at a time when most teams still focused on the run. It didn't happen overnight, but the seeds Edwards planted would soon blossom into a revolution, not just for BYU, but for the whole state of Utah. By the late 1970s, Utah football looked dramatically different from its 1890s roots. Utah history had stability, Utah State had tradition and a legendary alumni, and BYU was about to change the game.